discussion for Langfest this year is on AI and language. Our panelists are as follows. The first panelist we have is Ms. Meru Gokhale. She is the founder of Editrix.ai, an innovative platform dedicated to redefining the world of content creation and editorial precision through cutting-edge artificial intelligence. Ms. Gokhale has held leadership positions in prestigious publishing houses where she was instrumental in shaping award-winning literary works. Her ability to discover and nurture talent, combined with her editorial expertise, earned her a reputation as a leader in the publishing industry. She has worked closely with renowned authors and has an acute understanding of the nuances of creating compelling narratives that resonate with readers. Ms. Gokhale's vision for Editrix.ai is rooted in her belief in the transformative power of technology to enhance creativity rather than replace it. She is passionate to advocate diversity in storytelling. Please give a round of applause for our first panelist. Our second panelist for this discussion is Mr. Hemanth Chakravarti. Mr. Chakravarti is an AI scientist and a founder of Jana.ai, trained as a social scientist with a passion for making complex systems more transparent, effective, and accessible, trained in applied mathematics and economics at Harvard, and spent time in research and policy before founding India's first AI. At Jana, he is transforming how legal information is discovered, scrutinized, and understood, both externally in presence and regulation that affects the lives of people and businesses. Mr. Chakravarti is also a writer and a translator and has won the Charles Edmund Orman Prize for the Best Fiction Writer at Harvard. He's conducted independent research in translation studies with the Harvard Tamil Chair. Sir explores how language, whether expressed through policy, art, or code, can unlock social protection and resilience. Please give a round of applause for him. Now I will request Pavitra to introduce the other panelists.
The third panelist I'd like to introduce is Mr. Ramesh Acharya. Ramesh Acharya started his career in 2004 as an assistant art director in the film industry, working under the guidance of renowned art director Mr. Rajivan for 7 years. During this time, Mr. Acharya contributed to several notable films including February 14, Adi, Vetayadu Vilayadu, Vallavan, and Varanamayiram, among others. Let's all give a round of applause and welcome him. The last panelist I'd like to introduce you to is John Xavier. John Xavier is a technology editor and podcast host at The Hindu, where he writes about emerging trends in technology, shifts in business practices, and tech policy. As host of the Interface podcast, John connects with key industry leaders and opinion makers to get their perspectives on the dynamic world of business and technology. John has also written for Bloomberg. By taking an interest in writing and journalism, John built and ran leadership development initiatives at McKinsey & Company. Mr. John is an alumnus of Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, Asian College of Journalism, Chennai, and Loyola College, Chennai. Let's all give a big round of applause for the whole panelists.
So we can start. Hello. Thanks for joining here. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you to my fellow panelists. So the canvas that's been given to us is quite broad, AI and language. So when we start to think about this, the whole idea is the derivative has become larger than the underlying asset. By that I mean artificial intelligence is currently a derivative from the languages that is being built on. It's one aspect of intelligence that we are seeing. And that has taken a lot of precedence of late. Today, what we are trying to look at is through three different areas from Meru, who comes from editing and publishing background, on how AI is being used in her field and how she's applying new techniques there, and also trying to understand how these new trends in AI are affecting the publishing industry, And then next to me is Hemanth. Hemanth is an engineer himself, so he has kind of dabbled with these technology, to put it in very crude terms, bare hands to see how it works and how it doesn't work. So he has built something around legal AI systems. So that's another interesting area to look at in terms of how AI is being applied in that sector. And then after him is Ramesh. Ramesh comes from a very interesting background in AI, at least to me. When I saw his profile, is that all other things you see a lot of usage in terms of man and machine interface, but then he comes from a creative angle where a lot of human effort is still needed. So we are opening up to him to see what are some of the areas in which AI is being used in his domain. And this particular panel will also be a little bit in Tanglish to be a little more, relating to everybody, and also so that everybody could understand what are some of the things that we're discussing. So with that, I'd like to open it up, starting with Meru. If you could share for about a couple of minutes how you use AI in your field, and just to give a perspective to the audience on how AI is being used in publishing.
Okay, can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, so I'll just give you a little bit of context. I have been a book publisher and editor for 21 years now. And during that time, I've worked with all kinds of writers, from fiction, non-fiction, academics, all kind of work. I became very interested in using AI for editing, which is the core process in the publishing industry, and the one I am most familiar with. Can I just tell you that when I started doing this in 2022, people thought I was like the devil, that they thought I was a really horrible person for doing this. Because people have very emotional reactions to AI. And this is why I'm saying this, I'm putting it out there. But the reason I was doing this is that the current available technology, believe it or not, even now, which is available to do editing tasks, you'll all have used, is called spell check, okay? So spell check is absolutely fine if you're looking for a spelling error, but of course, if you're editing, you need to be able to do quite context-aware things. So if you've written a novel, you may have a character who has green eyes on page 10 and the eye color has changed to blue in page 30. Now, spell check obviously cannot catch that. All of that is reliant on a human editor, experienced human editor to do that. And I was just telling John that, as it turns out, I must be the only person in AI who isn't replacing anybody at all, because nobody wants to be an editor anymore. So nobody wants that. Because in order to be an editor, you have to be very highly educated, well-read, and want to be paid nothing. So people aren't exactly lining up for this job. So I was like, well, they'll forgive me eventually. So what happens is that, so this is of course one example. Then there are things like large context editing, which cannot currently be handled by anything. So how many of you want to be novelists in this audience?
All of us.
No. Okay, yeah, not just of the audience. Non-fiction writers, anyone wants to write a book? Yeah, okay, great. So the point is, when you're writing a book, you need to know whether it's boring, whether it's got a great opening, good ending, does it make sense? Not just spell check, which was the only thing available. So what I built it's called Editrix.ai. Editrix is the feminine of editor. So there is an editor and there's an Editrix. And it was an easy domain name to get, so I went for it. And what it does is, it does editing, which is called developmental editing. Developmental editing, structural editing, copy editing, and proofreading. So that was my journey into using AI for my profession.
Perfect. Okay. Hi, everybody. When Meru was talking about, someone who's highly educated, well-read, and willing to work for nothing, I thought maybe your next venture should be a company that makes AI startup founders like ourselves. Before I sort of get started with a little bit about the law, I thought maybe I should comment about the slides that were being made to AI during the time of the power cuts. There's actually a very lovely op-ed by Rahul Matan in yesterday's Mint, which talked about what our electricity grid lacks is a data system, which then has algorithms maintaining it to redistribute power loads. So actually, maybe this is also an AI problem.
It just came out a few days ago about this.
Perfect. That said, maybe just to kick off about the law is a very fun place to work on AI, and really, I ended up here a little bit in the reverse, in the sense that, of course, my dad used to practice the law, so it was always a little close to heart, but it was also very much, sort of holding a hammer and searching for nails to bang, in the sense that when GPT-2 came out and some of my friends had researcher access, we were doing silly things on it, like giving it the Old Testament and trying to see if it would produce a New Testament that would be, interesting and weird. But soon enough, we started, thinking about ways to build this into something interesting but also impactful. And I think the law stood out because it's uniquely a field where everything borrows from what we call in AI is a corpus of text, and then applies that to reproduce new corpuses of text. So what I mean by that is, if you go to the court, if you're in some kind of dispute or litigation, most of the work that your lawyer does is to find other cases that are similar in factual matter and in question of law that came before you, and then essentially try to cite that, produce a smaller excerpt from that larger corpus of excerpts in the court. Or you're in the world of contracts, where everything is based on language and the precision of language. And again, the whole process there is sort of conducting this conversion exercise, where you have some businesses that or people who handshake on some kind of thing that is of interest and value to them, and then the rest of it is just this performative, where process is the end in and of itself. So, you draw a contract, you sign it, nothing happens. People work as they plan to work with each other, but the performance of the law itself becomes the outcome there, in the sense that the mere process of writing it down and putting a signature on it is in itself of value. So I think the law is very interesting in this way, because so much of it is this borrowing and this negotiation of taking from what has come before and applying it to what is here. Literally, the foundational principle of common law is this Latin maxim that's called stare decisis, which means do nothing, roughly speaking. And the idea is that the role of a judge is to take from what came before and keep it consistent. So I think this is sort of obviously the specialization of what we have right now, which are these autoregressive textual models, which take a sequence of words from before and then produce new similar words to them. And that's the entire prediction exercise that they conduct. So then, it increasingly looked to us like we had a law-shaped hammer in our hand, and so the nail to pick was of not much controversy. So that's how I ended up here, and that's why I think it's sort of interesting in a very fundamental sense, in that AI seems like a very natural synchronization with the way we've defined modern legal systems since broadly Magna Carta to work. I'll do a pass.
Hello everybody. Sorry, நான் தமிழில் தான் பேச போகிறேன். எத்தனை பேருக்கு தமிழ் தெரியல. ஸோ எனக்கு ஏஐ எந்த அளவுக்கு யூஸ் ஆச்சுன்னா, இப்போது மூவிஸ் பண்ணும்போது எனக்கு ப்ரீ ப்ரொடக்ஷனுக்கு ரொம்ப சப்போர்ட்டிவாக இப்போ ஏஐ நான் யூஸ் பண்ணிகிட்ருக்கேன். என்னோடய டீம் போய் ஏஐ யூஸ் பண்ணுறதுக்கு நான் ட்ரைனிங் கொடுத்துட்ருக்கேன். அது என்ன ஆகுதுன்னா, ஒரு ஸ்டாண்டர்ட் லெவலுக்கு நமக்கு ஒரு க்ரியேட்டிவோட ஒரு ப்ராசஸ் ஜென்ரேட் பண்ணி கொடுக்குறது ஏஐ. அது ரொம்ப நல்லா இருக்குது. நம்மளோட இண்டஸ்ட்ரிக்கு ஃபிலிம் இண்டஸ்ட்ரிக்கு ரொம்ப சப்போர்ட்டிவாக இருக்குது. ஸோ ஒரு டெக்ஸ்ட்டு நம்ம கரெக்டாக அதில் கொடுத்துட்டோன்னா ஒரு 4 டைப்பில் அது இமேஜ் கொடுக்குது நமக்கு. நம்ம எல்லாருமே யூஸ் பண்ணுறோன்னு நினைக்கிறேன் இல்லையா? எல்லாருமே யூஸ் பண்ணுறீங்கன்னு நினைக்கிறேன் ஏஐ. பட் ஒரு ஃபிலிமுக்கு எப்படி அது சப்போர்ட்டிவாக இருக்குன்றது நான் யூஸ் பண்ணி பார்த்ததில் எனக்கு ரொம்ப ஹாப்பியாக இருக்குது. அதுவும் டே பை டே அதில் நிறையா டெவலப் ஆகிட்டே தான் இருக்குது. அவங்க அது நல்ல ப்ராசஸ் ரொம்ப நல்லா பண்ணிகிட்ருக்காங்க. ஸோ மிட்ஜர்னின்றது ஒன்று தான் நான் யூஸ் பண்ணிகிட்ருக்கேன். நீங்களும் ட்ரை பண்ணி பாருங்கள். மிட்ஜர்னின்றது எதுவாக இருந்தாலும், அதாவது நம்ம ஒரு வீடு கட்டுறோம், ஒரு இன்டீரியர் டிசைன் நமக்கு தேவைப்படுது, எனி ப்ராப்ஸ் நம்ம ஒன்று வேணும்னா அது நம்ம கரெக்டான ஒரு டெக்ஸ்ட்டு கொடுத்துட்டா அது ஒரு 4 வெரைட்டியில் நமக்கு அந்த டிசைன் காமிக்கிறது ரொம்ப சூப்பராக இருக்குது. ஸோ எனக்கு என்ன ஆகுதுன்னா, நம்ம பண்ணுற ஒர்க் அடுத்த ஸ்டேஜ் போகிறதுக்கு ஏஐ ரொம்ப சப்போர்ட்டிவாக இருக்குது. ஸோ நான் என்னோடய ப்ராஜெக்ட், இப்போ ஒரு ப்ராஜெக்டே ஃபுல்லாக கம்ப்ளீட்டாக ஏஐ வச்சு ஒரு ஃபுல் மூவியை நான் முடிச்சிட்டேன். ஸோ அது என்னாச்சு, அது ஒரு ப்ராசஸில் போயிட்டுருக்கு. அதனால் பார்க்குறவங்களுக்கு என்ன ஆகுதுன்னா ஒரு படம் இப்படி தான் வந்து நாளைக்கு வரப்போகுது அப்படிங்கிறதுக்கு எனக்கு ஏஐ வந்து பயங்கர சப்போர்ட்டிவ் ஆயிடுச்சு. அதுக்கு ஒரு பேக்ட்ராப் கொடுத்து ஒரு மியூசிக் கொடுத்து, அதுவுமே ஏஐயில் பண்ணுறேன். ஒரு மியூசிக் கொடுக்குறேன். அது என்ன ஆகுதுன்னா ஒரு ஃபுல்லாக ஒரு ஃபிலிம் பார்க்குற மூடை வந்து ஏஐ வந்து ரொம்ப சிம்பிளாக குயிக்காக ஒரு டேயில் வந்து நமக்கு எல்லாமே முடிகிறதா ஏஐ நான் ரொம்ப யூஸ் பண்ணுறது எனக்கு ரொம்ப சப்போர்ட்டிவாக இருக்குது. தேங்க்யூ.
Thank you, Ramesh. So just to give you context on what Ramesh said is this, largely he's using AI in pre-production, and it has gone to a stage where he is now starting to build entire footages or clips of movies using artificial intelligence. So with that, நான் உங்ககிட்ட ஒரு அடுத்த கேள்வி வரேன். இப்போ அந்த க்ரியேட்டிவ் ப்ராசஸ் இருக்குது. ஸோ க்ரியேட்டிவ் ப்ராசஸில் வந்து யூ ஹாவ் டு திங்க் த்ரூ த ஹோல் திங். அதில் வந்து யூ டெவலப் அ பர்டிகுலர் ப்ராடக்ட். ஸோ இப்போ நீங்கள் ஏஐன்ற ப்ரீ ப்ரொடக்ஷனில் இது யூஸ் பண்ணுறது என்ன மாதிரி உங்களுடைய ஒர்க் லோடை மாற்றுது?
அதான் சார், முதல்ல என்ன பண்ணிகிட்டு இருந்தேன்னா, நான் பேசிக்காக வந்து நான் ஆர்டிஸ்ட்ன்றதுனால எனக்கு ப்ரொடக்ஷனுக்கு மற்றவங்களுக்கு வந்து ஸ்டோரி போர்டு கொடுக்குறது சிம்பிள் ஸ்கெட்சாக பண்ணிகிட்டு இருந்தேன் ஃபஸ்ட்டு. ஸோ ஃப்ரேம் பை ஃப்ரேம் சிம்பிள் ஸ்கெட்ச் பண்ணும்போது அது ஒரு டைப் ஆஃப் ஒரு அண்டர்ஸ்டாண்டிங் டைரக்டர்ஸ்க்கு வரும். நான் டைரக்டர்ஸ்க்கு ஒர்க் பண்ணி கொடுக்கும்போது தென் இப்போ ஒரு செட் ஒர்க் பண்ணுறேன் போது எனக்கு ஸ்கெட்ச் ரொம்ப இம்பார்ட்டன்ட். ஏன்னா அதோட ஸ்கேல் என்ன மாதிரி இருக்கும், இந்த மாதிரி ரூம் செட்டு போடுறோன்னா அதெல்லாம் ஒரு 3 டைமென்ஷனில் நாங்கள் ஸ்கெட்ச் பண்ணுறது இட்ஸ் டேக் டைம். அது வந்து நமக்கு டைம் வேணும். இப்போ என்ன அது அந்த டைமை வந்து ரொம்ப சேவ் பண்ணுறது வந்து ஏஐயில் நடக்குது. அது ரொம்ப சிம்பிளாக நம்ம கொடுக்குற டெக்ஸ்ட்டு வந்து அதோட கலர் என்ன, வுட்டு என்ன, டைல்ஸ் அப்படிங்கிறதெல்லாம் நம்ம டெக்ஸ்ட்டாக கொடுத்துட்டாவே அது வேறு ஒரு 4 இமேஜை கொடுக்கும்போது என்ன ஆகுதுன்னா நமக்கு ஆப்ஷன்ஸ் நிறைய கிடைக்குது. ஸோ ஒரு கிளைண்ட்டுக்கிட்ட போய் நம்ம அதை காமிக்கிறோம் அப்படின்னும்போது அவங்க என்ன ஆகுதுன்னா ஆப்ஷன்ஸ் நிறையா சூஸ் பண்ணுறதுக்கு ரொம்ப ஈஸியாக இருக்குது. டக்குன்னு ஒரு விஷயம் வந்து செலக்ட் ஆகிடுதாங்க. ஸோ அது ரொம்ப எனக்கு ஹெல்ப்ஃபுல்லாக இருக்குது.
இப்போ அதில் ஒரு ஃபாலோ அப் கொஸ்டின் இஸ், இப்போ அது காமிக்கிற இமேஜ் உங்களால் ஃபிசிக்கலாக கொடுக்க முடியுதா, ஆர் இட் இஸ் சம்திங் இட் இஸ் கிரியேட்டிங்?
அதான் இதோட அடுத்த ஸ்டேஜ் நான் சொல்கிறேன் சார். ஏன்னா ஏஐ வந்து கம்ப்ளீட்டாக நமக்கு ஒரு ப்ரீ ப்ரொடக்ஷனுக்கு தான் யூஸ் பண்ண முடியுதே தவிர அது ஒரு இப்போ இதை பார்த்துட்டு நான் சிஜியில் நான் ஒர்க் பண்ணுவேன். இப்போ நான் அனிமேஷன் பண்ணும்போது எனக்கு ஒரு பீப்புள்கிட்ட, ஒரு சிஜி பீப்புள்கிட்ட என் டீமுக்கிட்ட கொடுக்கும்போது அது ஒரு பிளெண்டர்லேயோ இல்லை எனி சாஃப்ட்வேர்லேயோ சப்போஸ் ஒரு மாயாவில் ஒர்க் பண்ணால் கூட இது ஒரு அவுட்புட் இப்படி தான் வரும்ன்றத ஸ்டாண்டர்ட்லேயே நம்ம அந்த ஒர்க் பண்ணலாம். ஸ்கெட்சில் பண்ணும்போது அதோட கலர்ஸ் நமக்கு காமிக்க முடியாது. மேபி ஒரு வேளை நான் வந்து கலரை வந்து ஸ்ட்ரோக் பண்ணி காமிச்சா கூட அந்த ரிஃப்ளெக்ஷன், அதோட ஸ்டைலு, அதோட பவுன்ஸ் லைட்டில் என்ன வரப்போகுது, ஸோ ஒரு லைட் சோர்ஸில் எப்படி இருக்கும், இதெல்லாமே ஏஐயில் கொடுக்குறதுனால அந்த ஃபைனல் அவுட் இப்படி தான் வருங்கிறதுலே வேலை வந்து நமக்கு ஈஸியாக கன்வே பண்ண முடியுது.
ஸோ ப்ரீ ப்ரொடக்ஷனே இஸ் ஒன் ஸ்டெப் அஹெட்ல.
ஆமாம், அது எனக்கு ரொம்ப சப்போர்ட்டிவாக இருக்குது, ஈஸியாக இருக்குது ரொம்ப.
Got it. So just to kind of paraphrase what Ramesh is saying is, the pre-production work that he does using AI is one step better than what he used to do without the tools. So he's using some of these tools to build his pre-production work and taking that to clients to show it as a way to take it from there in terms of the production. So from there I'd like to shift to Hemanth about the point that you raised about judgments and justice. I mean, we are seeing a lot of interpretation of law and other things, and AI giving a sense on how to interpret a law. But does AI understand justice?
So, I think the way I think of the role of a judge is broadly 2 things. One is what they do in terms of their legal understanding, and the other is what they do in terms of their subjective understanding. I think obviously the problem with AI is that you have to retrain it and sort of rebuild it to work for any subjective understanding. This could be, you have a domestic violence case or you have an inheritance dispute. The role of the judge is not just to sort of document the facts and sort of consider what the outcome was and what the decision is. It's also to think about, okay, what is the nature of that family? What is the nature of that place that they're from? What is their religion? What is the caste background? And then they give some kind of consideration or compensation or whatever fits. I think what will end up happening is that this first set of roles, which are about essentially building the legal understanding of the problem, understanding the factual matter, thinking about how courts have ruled about similar matters before will be conducted increasingly by AI systems. And it will be this sort of slightly comedic system where your lawyer has an AI, their lawyer has an AI, the AI sort of give points, they present it against each other, and then the judge has their own AI and they in turn review their points with that AI. But I think what will remain is that all three of these parties now become, I mean, and I think this is not just a question in the law, it's a question everywhere, is what will be the role of humans in this post-AI society? And I think it's not even necessarily true that AI will not be able to reproduce cultural understanding. We see that, with more training, with more focus on specific contexts, if we, give it more Indian data, more cultural data, more Indian language data, it does pick up that context and understanding relatively quickly. But I think then it becomes a question of self-determination and democratic principle. And we have to think of it not in terms of what is possible, but what we want. And I think a resolution for what we want that works very well for me is this understanding that we have these aids and tools that do a lot of the litigation for the parties and for the judge explain the case and sort of what the background of the law there is. But then that subjective understanding and application is sort of retained with the judge themselves. And I think some jurisdictions have already been fast to act on this, right? Like in 2016 or so, France already banned any tools that attempt to predict the outcomes of judicial process, especially court cases. And I think that's a trend that we'll see growing in many places, in that there are certain tasks that will become entirely AI native. So if it's like translation, transcription, a lot of the judge's staff are one person who takes down what they dictate, one person who copy edits it and stuff. So these roles don't need to be performed by humans anymore. Even legal research, which is like, there are 15 million judgments that have come before us. How do I find the right 5 cases that are the most similar and presented in court? That's not necessarily a task that is best done or easiest done by a human. So then the question is, what is a task that is best done by a human? And I think more than thinking of it as a matter of efficiency, I think of it as, okay, we want to preserve the right to make mistakes. We want to preserve a certain sense of self-determination. And we want to preserve a certain sense of empathy that we think is sort of unique to the human emotional psyche or somatic experience or whatever. So I think then we just decide, okay, there are certain parts of this, like sentencing, is something that's subjective. So if I declare you guilty, what is your punishment? Or if I say there was an instance of, someone being removed from an inheritance unfairly, the part that is coming to that conclusion of guilt or to the conclusion of wrongdoing can be done by the AI. But the part that is the resolution and settlement thereof is, I think, where the emotional application comes in, where you think about, if there was an accused in a murder case, was there some provocation that was causing it? Was there something wrong with their emotional state, with their mental health and so on? Or if you think of, rewarding a battered woman some kind of compensation, what is the compensation that is both sort of righteous, but also suitable for the socioeconomic context that they come from? I think these are the questions that we presumably want humans to retain control over. So I think increasingly it will become a choice, not even a question of, what is happening.
Choice as in the use?
As a society, we have to choose it. And we'll have to change our legal systems to adopt that choice in its structure.
Yeah, which is sort of evident in this Paris AI Action Summit, where AI has started to become more an opportunity than a safety initiative.
Right. I mean, if you're talking about the current Paris AI Summit, I think, everyone wants to get in on the action when it's still hot. But I think we need bigger ideas and bigger changes, right? Like the problem I always keep pointing out to the AI, and this is detracting from the legal question a bit, but if you look at India's upward mobility story, and this is most of my family, is, you start off, the median Indian is someone who starts off probably in a rural farm family, if you look at the last 30, 40 years, especially after 91, with 1 acre of land on average, let's say, or 1 or 2 acres, some very small plot of land, or no land whatsoever. And then from there, you get some kind of private university, presumably in Tamil Nadu, engineering education. And then you move to a city. You start out at HCL or TCS or Infosys or one of these service providers. You make 40, 50,000 salary in a few years. You make 1.5 lakhs by the time your kids are 10 or 12. And that is essentially a sort of jump over a barrier that we have right now, right? And that's because we have returns to labor, but specifically returns to education, returns to skilled labor, and so on and so forth. What I think will happen in the post-AI world is that this will shift to becoming returns to capital. So all of this kind of white-collar work, this kind of service work, will be done at a higher quality and a lower speed by an AI system, So instead of, the service money going from, say, Silicon Valley to Bangalore and then back, or to Chennai and then back, I think what will happen is it will rotate within Silicon Valley, where the buyer will be in the US and the provider will be Microsoft or some company Microsoft has bought a lot of. And if that money keeps rotating there, I think it's not just judicial questions we have to redesign, right? I don't know how we have an understanding of tax if we've built this, as you're saying, derivative work that has captured all of human knowledge and can now produce new insights from that human knowledge better than any human. And that derivative work requires $100 billion worth of computers and GPU chips. Then what happens if, the consumers are those with wealth and the service providers are those with wealth who have built AI systems on their chips? Then I think we have to even think about, how does taxation work? How does, democracy work? How does the nation state and the border work? And I think all of these questions that we've taken basically for granted since the end of monarchy, since Enlightenment for the last 200 years, come back on the blackboard. And this whole international law thing of, okay, we'll stop all conquest, we'll think of borders as where they are. Even that idea doesn't work if you think of this world where all the buyers are in America and the service providers now through AI are also in America. The question is, like, what even happens to this circulation of trade and economy that we've been building on top of?
Actually, that's a very interesting point. With that, I'd like to pick on Meru's ideas on, because given that Hemanth has mentioned a very interesting point in terms of round tripping within a particular geography. So if you want to look at creativity and specific ethnic languages, like for instance, India has so many, it's a multicultural society with so many different languages. How should publishing and the industry that's more into building creative works should be looking at these smaller, as a minority languages that are not represented well enough? What kind of role do these have in the age of AI?
I think that's a great question. Personally, I think if you're a small publisher anywhere in the world, AI is a huge opportunity. To give you an example, we had interest from publishers around the world in languages from Serbian, Croatian, Macedonian, Cree, number of Indian languages, asking if Editrix would work in that language. And my answer to them was, I don't know, but you can try. And we tried, and actually it worked. And it's a mystery in machine learning why most of this data is English, but it seems to work in 90% to the same level in many, many other languages. No one knows exactly why. Why I think this is a good thing for publishers and writers, and this is based on not on my experience in AI, but on my experience in publishing, is that what do Western writers have, which writers from other countries don't have, is very, very high quality editing to make sure their book is the very, very best it can be. So when you see a Hollywood movie, for example, the post-production, the finishing, the look, the feel is very, very high. And sometimes, even though the story may be good from another country, but it just doesn't look like as professional as a professional movie. Now, to me, in your industry, in my industry, there is a leveling, and that is why there is resistance. Because whenever there is any kind of leveling action, the existing incumbents will resist it, and that is what we are seeing right now. So, from where I'm sitting, I'll give you an example. I went to Bhutan last year, and they have a very small, maybe the smallest publishing industry in the world of maybe 100 writers, but not a single editor. And all those 100 writers wanted an editor. Now, out of, let's say it was 1,000 writers, 2,000 writers, and 2 of them were any good, the chances of the rest of the world picking them up, because it actually is at that level that you would get in London or New York. If you make that accessible to everybody, then I think it's a very democratizing thing. Separately, just this is something which happens in publishing. Let's say you're a writer in Tamil, and you want a publisher in the US or the UK to look at your book. A very simple, practical thing is how they're going to read it. So if you use good AI tools now to make a good book proposal in English, which is likely to get picked up by an international publisher, or alternatively, you want to make your book in Tamil the best that it can be, there's never been a better time. So my advice to writers and publishers in languages other than English is the best time to be doing what you're doing.
That's very interesting. you want to
எஸ் இப்போ இன்னொரு விஷயம் ரொம்ப நல்ல ஏஐயில் ரொம்ப எனக்கு சப்போர்ட்டிவாக இருக்கிறது. இப்போ எனக்கு இப்போ ஜெர்மனியில் என்ன நடக்குதுன்னு எனக்கு தெரியாது. ஸோ அதோட கல்ச்சர் பற்றி எனக்கு தெரியாது. நம்ம மூவிஸில் பார்க்குறத வச்சு நம்ம ஒரு ரெஃபரன்ஸ் எடுக்கிறோம் அப்படிங்கிறது மாதிரி ஏஐயில் நான் வந்து ஒரு டெக்ஸ்ட்டில் எனக்கு ஜெர்மனோட அந்த பீப்புளோட ஏதாவது ஒரு லொக்கேஷன் இல்லைன்னா அவங்க கல்ச்சரில் இருக்கிற ஏதோ பேக்ட்ராப்னா ஈஸியாக அதை வந்து ஜென்ரேட் பண்ணி கொடுத்துருது. ஸோ எனக்கு ரொம்ப ஈஸியாக இருக்குது. என்னென்னா எந்த டைப் ஆஃப் ஸ்டோரி நம்ம வந்து இப்போ நம்ம இருந்தாலும் அதுக்கு பேக்ரவுண்டில் அதுக்கு தகுந்த மாதிரியான இமேஜ் வந்து க்ரியேட் பண்ணுறது ஏஏவே அந்த ரெஸ்பான்சிபிலிட்டி எடுத்துக்குது. எனக்கு ரொம்ப ஈஸியாக இருக்குது. என்னென்னா அந்த டோன் அங்கே இருக்கிற சப்போஸ் வேறு கண்ட்ரீஸோட ஏதாவது ஒரு பேக்ட்ராப் வேணும்னா அங்கே ஸ்னோ இருக்குமா இருக்காதா, அந்த வெதர் எப்படி இருக்கும், ஸோ அதெல்லாம் ஒரு கான்செப்டில் வரும்போது அது ஏஏவே நமக்கு பெருசாக கொடுக்குறது வந்து அது நம்ம ரிசர்ச் பண்ணுறத அது எடுத்துக்கிறது ரொம்ப நமக்கு ஹெல்ப்ஃபுல்லாக இருக்குது அந்த விஷயம். அது வந்து ஒரு ஸ்டோரி டெல்லருக்கு ரொம்பவுமே சப்போர்ட்டு. அது க்ரியேட்டிவாக இருக்கிற இப்போ சப்போஸ் ஏஐ யூஸ் பண்ணாத டைரக்டர்ஸ் இல்லை அதை பற்றி அந்த நாலேஜ் இல்லாதவங்களுக்கு நம்ம இது சப்போர்ட்டிவாக கொடுக்குறதுல ரொம்ப அவங்களுக்கு ஹெல்ப்ஃபுல்லாக இருக்குது.
ஸோ அதில் காப்பிரைட் ஆஸ்பெக்ட் எப்படி ஹேண்டில் பண்ணுறீங்க? ஃபார் இன்ஸ்டன்ஸ் ஒரு இமேஜ் ஆர் சம்திங் அதுலேருந்து டெவலப் பண்ணி வருது, அது வந்து அது வேற ஒருத்தவங்களோட காப்பிரைட்டாக இருக்குது?
இல்லை சார், அதுதான் இதில் பியூட்டி. என்னென்னா நீங்கள் என்ன டெக்ஸ்ட் கொடுக்குறீங்களோ அந்த டெக்ஸ்ட்டுக்கு அதை ஜென்ரேட் பண்ணி கொடுக்குறது நம்மளோட ஓன் தான், அது யாரோடதும் கிடையாது. பட் அதுக்கு வந்து இப்போ தனியாக ஒரு ரூல்ஸ் போட்டிருக்காங்க. மற்ற ஆர்டிஸ்ட்டோடது எதுவும் பிக் பண்ண முடியாத அளவுக்கு அதில் ஏதோ காப்பிரைட் சம்திங் அந்த மாதிரி இருக்கிறத தாண்டி தான் இப்போ நமக்கு இது வருது. சப்போஸ் இப்போ நமக்கு ஒரு இன்ஸ்பயரான ஒரு பெயிண்டிங்கை பற்றி நம்ம டெக்ஸ்ட் போட்டோன்னா, இப்போ மோனலிசா மாதிரி எனக்கு ஒரு பொண்ணு வந்து ரியலில் வேணும்னு சொல்லி நீங்கள் டைப் பண்ணிங்கன்னா சப்போஸ் அது ரைட்ஸில் இருந்ததுன்னா அதை எடுத்துக்காது, ஏஐ வந்து நமக்கு அது சப்போர்ட் பண்ணாது. சிமிலராக வேறு ஒரு ஆர்டிஸ்ட்டோடது வேணால் அதை எடுத்துக்கும், காப்பிரைட்ஸில் இல்லாத ஒரு ஆர்டிஸ்ட்டோடது எடுத்து வேணால் நமக்கு அது அவுட்புட் கொடுக்கும். ஒரு ரெமரண்டோடது வந்து எடுத்து காமிக்கும் மேபி அது ரைட்ஸில் இல்லைன்னா. ஸோ இது மாதிரி நமக்கு வேணுங்கிறத பிக் பண்ணுறதுக்கும் எந்த பர்சனோட ஒரு விஷயம் நமக்கு வேணுங்கிறத நம்ம இந்தியன் கல்ச்சரோட மிக்ஸ் பண்ணி கூட அதை எடுத்துக்கலாம். ஸோ அது ரொம்ப சூப்பராக இருக்குது, க்ரியேட்டிவாக எனக்கு ரொம்ப சப்போர்ட்டிவாக இருக்குது அது ஆக்சுவலாக.
ஸோ ரீசெண்ட்லி வெரி சிமிலர் இன்சிடென்ட், பட் இன் டர்ம்ஸ் ஆஃப் trying to get an image that we want for a story. So we were doing a story around cyber criminals and hacking. So it's a general common bias in the images that you see around all these hacking stories. Is somebody sitting with a hoodie in front of the computer and they are hacking. This is the common theme. So we wanted to basically screw up the AI system. So we wanted to ask எனக்கு வந்து ஹேக் வேஷ்டி கட்டிட்டு யாரோ ஹேக் பண்ணுற மாதிரி எனக்கு இது பண்ணுங்க அப்படின்னா. ஸோ இந்தியாவில் இருக்கிற டெவலப்பர்ஸ் ஒரு சில ஃபோட்டோஸ் எடுத்து போட்டு
நீங்கள் அர்னால்டே வேஷ்டி கட்டி நம்ம மார்க்கெட்டில் மிஷின் கண்ணோட சண்டை போடுற மாதிரி பண்ணலாம்.
So anything is possible with it.
எல்லாமே possible.
Actually that actually takes me to the idea of copyright itself. Like do copyrights matter anymore? Like, you know, when AI is coming and so many other things, and also you look at the number of permutation and combination of so many different images, do copyrights matter?
So I have two levels of answer here. One is the more reasonable answer and the other is my crazy answer. So the more reasonable answer is, இப்போ சாரோட எக்ஸாம்பிள் எடுத்துக்கணும்னா, I think we can think of it as this tree of technology we've had to produce art. So if you think of digital artists and the fact that they can download brushes which essentially are a form of having some ready-made form that they can reproduce instantly, we don't think of that as a copyright failure. Similarly, if you can, you know, there's other tools like that, or maybe there's a storyboard maker which gives you like a layout, or you know, any of these scripting tools that we've been using for a while. So there's clearly a continuous line, and somewhere in there we feel that your contribution has been less or more. When it comes to the idea of AI generation for images, it's a very interesting problem because obviously most of the work is done in training of the model, but that particular image cannot be produced without that unique human AI interaction, in that only your prompt in conjunction with that model can produce it. So I think then it becomes blurrier and blurrier. So at that point, I think we should sort of fall back to my crazy answer, which is, I don't know if copyright ever really mattered. And I know sitting next to publishers and saying this is sort of a double-edged sword. But I mean, I sort of personally also come from this sort of school of Aaron Swartz, who was the postdoc in MIT who tried to upload all of JSTOR to the internet and then was persecuted for it and eventually committed suicide. I don't think even humans produce particularly unique or novel knowledge. I think everything, we are also in distribution stochastic parrots the way AI is. And what I mean by that is, we have very good evidence that the way babies learn language but also ideas is by randomly copying things around them till they start to get rewards for saying certain patterns that are good, and then they sort of recognize patterns that keep complex. So you can just keep complexifying by stacking patterns one above the other. So then if humans are just these beings who sort of take from the commons, mix it up, and in some linear combination we can give some, some weighted average of ideas before us produces new ideas. And then we have made AI in the image of the human brain to do exactly that, in that it looks at sort of all language that has come before it and then reproduces something. Then I wonder, I think there shouldn't be, yes, copyright is meaningless, but really what AI is pointing out is the meaninglessness of copyright that has always been true. And I think it's more of a sort of revelation or reckoning rather than a sort of meaningful change in how things work. In that I don't think ideas or execution has ever been different before this. It's just much more obvious when you are sort of programming a simpler version of a human brain to do that exact sort of agglomeration and copy exercise. So no, my broad take is that copyright should be substantially weaker or not exist, and that in general, I think, yes, we have to find structures to compensate artists or producers of work, but I think there have been models that have come up since that do that without producing this exclusive idea of rights and license to ideas and then keeping it artificially protected in the marketplace of ideas.
Right. That's taking me ball to your court now. I mean, he's saying copyright is not very essential, but I mean, how do you see from the creative perspective? That is one. And second is, how do you also look at the nuance in writing or creative task, anything, right? How do the nuances factor into an AI-generated work, even if you're using it just as a prompt engineer tool to get some additional input? So I sort of, I'm taking it back to our discussion before we started the whole discussion here. So could you give a sense around that?
Yeah. So I don't agree that copyright is dead, though I do think that copyright is evolving. And I'll give you some examples of that. The thing which I think we as humans find really hard to accept is when two contradictory things are true. I do think that copyright is important, but I also think AI is important. And I think what's the difficulty is both these things are very true at the same time right now. What I would say is that I think the industry is trying in a bunch of different ways to deal with this problem. I think if I read correctly, a few days ago, the Authors Guild, or maybe a few weeks ago, the Authors Guild in the UK is thinking about creating a licensing authority. So rather than an AI, kind of like, I'm sure, how many students in the audience? How many of you were students once? How many of you have photocopied anything? How many of you know that that's illegal, or it was until recently? Yeah, see, everyone's looking at me like, well, the legal there was a huge case with Oxford University Press, which actually the students won, which is this kind of a crude version of this, that technically photocopying someone's work, you have to pay them a royalty. Of course, nobody does this, right? And so they have something called I don't know what it's called, I'm sure it's not called the Photocopy Authority, but something like that, where they have a collective license. And if you own a photocopier, you have to pay that licensing authority. And it's somehow calculated, and every author gets a certain amount of money every month. And there was a case in India where Oxford University Press said that students should not be allowed to photocopy entire books. Now everyone does this. They lost the case. So my point is that this has been evolving for a while. Because of technology, book piracy is a huge problem well before AI came into the picture. What is a more challenging thing for countries, I think, will be that, let's say today, if India woke up and said, we will not allow we're not going to look at how copyright is, we're just going to keep it exactly as it is. In the case of Japan, last year, I believe it was the first country to do so, Japan has made the use of copyrighted material for AI training legal already. So really, if you go to, if a country turns around and says, you can't do that, you can legally go to Japan and do that. So I would see a competitive marketplace emerging for just like tax havens, for where you would be able to, I'm not just talking about Japan, I think you're seeing this in the UK, US, this is where the law is headed. So I don't think copyright is irrelevant. I do think how it is protected and legally codified is in for a big change, which we're already seeing.
Right. And in terms of the nuances, like for instance, is AI bringing down the average intelligence or the way somebody writes to a more baser level, or are we getting better? I mean, for pre-production work, of course, Ramesh said that it's actually getting things better. But then, for somebody who wants to become good at a language, what's happening?
Okay, so I'm going to say something which is going to be very shocking for many people. It's not that if you write a book, millions of people are going to line up and read it, okay? So the problem with creativity, and I think that, which people think that suddenly AI is going to write millions of books and people, that it's going to put writers out of business. My point is, it's very hard even to convince people to read the writers that are there. The problem is not enough. It's not that there's not enough content. There's already too much content. Content creation was never a problem. Content consumption is a problem. Finding readers who want to read is a problem. And this is not an AI problem. So, and in terms of, the nuance, I would say, if you're a writer, so far what I have seen is that in order to succeed in the marketplace of books, pretty much it was very important to write very, very well in the English language. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not sure. I would love to see people who have a great story to tell, who feel that maybe their English is not good enough, to feel confident enough to write it using AI as a tool. I think, to me, personally, I've always felt the story, the experience, the human element is more important than the stylistic elements, which until now have been kind of up there. So I would say, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to does it make humans dumber or smarter. I think the dumb ones will always be dumb and the smart ones will probably, always be smart. And actually, I would say, I would add one thing to that. AI is great for the curious. So if you're curious and do not have the opportunity to grow, there is no better tool than AI right now, in my opinion.
With that, I'd like to open it up for the audience. If anybody has a question to any one of the panelists.
So I have a question about O3, the OpenAI O3 thing. Now they're working on like abstract, basically understanding of like abstract concepts and to answer back to the user. What do you think the outlook is like with that usually? Like how is it going to develop in the future?
You mean how the language models are developing in future?
Yes, and now in this recent research that they did, they're basically trying to make it go more abstract, as in like more like human, like generate abstract answers and stuff, not just plain answers. So how is the outlook like? That's the question.
Did you get the question?
Yeah. So, no, I think maybe, let me try to rephrase this. Are you asking about how models are developing to sort of get to parts of intelligence that seem more complex than other things?
Yes, exactly.
So something that's not a Google search, but 10 results summarized, but rather is some kind of ideation or theory or critique. I think, yes, this will keep happening. And, we've had different paradigms where we've found success for how to train a model to make it more and more of a human level thinker. We already have models that can do better at the Math Olympiad or the Informatics Olympiad than the gold medalist from that year. We already have models that can, solve any coding problem or any logic problem. I think specifically, language in long form is something we haven't solved very well yet. But I think in the next 10 years, most of these things are just a sort of ticking time bomb. And we'll get to the point where models will be able to perform a lot of human level intelligence tasks, and certainly the overwhelming majority of white collar professional work. So then, like, the final question is, will it sort of reach this level of human, thinking? And I think this is maybe what I was talking about in terms of we have to then sort of come to what we define as art or abstraction or as language. If we think, if we agree on something like a Chomsky-esque idea that there is this underlying, world of thought, and that gets reflected in signs and symbols. Essentially, I guess the question I'm trying to pose is, do we think language is innate to thought or post hoc to thought? So is there a layer of thought that happens which can come out in terms of any symbols? And if that is true, that it can come out in any symbol, then language is probably the best set of symbols we have for thought. And so if there is an AI model that sort of natively understands how these symbols work, essentially the question is like, which direction does it go? Can you get from the symbol to new thoughts, or is it always that there is this underlying level of thought and then from there symbols are produced? And I think this question doesn't even rely on what we think of AI, but rather what we think of how the human mind works and what makes us human. And so I think if we think it's possible once you have all the symbols you need to produce any ideas, because of course all ideas can be written in the words we have right now. We don't need new words, we need new ideas most of the times. So I think that's really the question to ask here is, is there this level of ideas and then this level of symbols, and do we only go from here to here, or is there other ways in which new thought can be produced? And if we think there's any other way in which new thought can be produced, then I think yes, in the next 10-15 years we'll see AI models that are Einsteins and Borges and anyone and everything that you can think of.
Yeah, that answered my question. Thank you.
AI editing the works of authors. What reactions have authors given to you about some AI tool or some intelligence editing? So as I don't call myself an author, I just try to write. I would feel very personally offended if some AI tool comes up and tells me your emotion is not in the right place. So I would want to know if authors you've worked with had some experiences where they don't like how AI has edited their work.
That's a really interesting question, and I've seen a range of reactions. Most of the, in a way, ties up to your question. Is the fundamental question is, do we think that human beings are the pinnacle of intelligence in this universe? If you believe that, I don't, obviously. Yeah. So I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that. I think they're very, very amazing at a lot of things, and some things they're like behave like jailbroken AI, And so what I would say to that is that it's funny that I had an author. I've of course given this very kind of feedback in human form to an author. When AI me gives it, sometimes they take it less personally. And I had an author, and she was writing, and she ran it through my software, and then she sent me a screenshot, and it said, you know what, you're being really mean-spirited, okay? And she was very happy, and she said, if you had said this to me, I would have been really angry with you. But because it was not you, I fixed it. And so, I don't know, I wasn't expecting that. Then, of course, I see some authors, though I haven't actually seen as much of that as I thought I would, there is a small minority of authors who do believe that human beings are the pinnacle of intelligence in this universe, and those kind of people tend to not like it.
Hi, thank you. My question is related to some ethical issues with AI. As you know that some deepfake videos of politicians and actors' videos has created some political instability and social cohesion. So, is there any regulation, or how we can regulate the use of a generative AI?
I think that falls into Ramesh's sphere, and I think a lot of areas they are working on reducing the deepfake. I think he can speak more about it.
Deepfake videosலாம் வந்து பொலிட்டிஷியன்ஸோட வீடியோஸ்லாம் வந்து டீப்பேக் பண்ணி அது வந்து எலெக்ஷன் ரிசல்ட்ஸே வந்து மாற்றுது. அதே மாதிரி ரீசெண்டாக 2 years பேக் வந்து ஒரு ஃபேமஸ் ஆக்டர்ஸோட வீடியோலாம் வந்து ரொம்ப ஒரு ப்ராப்ளம்லாம் க்ரியேட் பண்ணி இந்த மாதிரிலாம் இருக்குது. ஸோ தேர் இஸ் நோ டினைங் தட் ஏஐயோட பொட்டன்ஷியலை வந்து
நான் ஒரு விஷயம், அதாவது காலகாலமாக எது நல்லது வந்தாலும் நம்ம கெட்டதாக ஒன்று யூஸ் பண்ணுறதுக்குன்னு நமக்கு ஒரு புத்தி இருக்கும்ல, அது நம்ம அதை பற்றி நம்ம பேசவே வேண்டாம்ல. இது நல்லதாக யூஸ் பண்ணால் நல்லதாக நமக்கு ஒரு அவுட் கிடைக்கும்ன்றது மாதிரியே போயிட்டா இதோட ரிசல்ட் நல்லாயிருக்கும். அதனால் இப்போ பீப்புளுக்கு என்ன ஆகுதுன்னா, அதனால் ஒன்றும் இல்லை, அதை பற்றி யாரும் பேச போகிறது இல்லை. இதில் வேறு என்ன பண்ணலான்னு யோசிச்சா அதை விட பெரிய அவுட் கொடுக்கறதுக்கான ஒரு ஏஐயை நம்ம மிஸ்யூஸ் பண்ண வேணான்னு தான் நான் சொல்ல முடியும். அது வந்து என்ன பிரச்சனைன்றதெல்லாம் ஒரு க்ரியேட்டிவாக நமக்கு அது அந்த இடத்துல அதை பற்றி யோசிக்க தேவையில்லைங்கிறேன். கரெக்டாக நீங்கள் இப்போ அந்த மாதிரி ஒன்று யோசிக்கிறீங்கள, அப்படி பண்ண வேண்டான்றது எந்த விஷயமா இருந்தாலும் அப்படி ஒரு தாட்டுக்கு போக வேண்டாம்ல.
பட் என்ன சார் பண்ணுறாங்க, அது எப்படி நம்ம வந்து அட்ரஸ் பண்ணுறது?
அதனால் அவங்களுக்கு என்ன பெனிஃபிட்ன்றது ஒன்று இருக்குல்ல, அதனால் என்ன பெனிஃபிட், ஒருத்தரை பற்றி நம்ம இன்னொருத்தரை அது மிஸ்யூஸ் பண்ணுறதுன்றதுல அதில் என்ன சந்தோஷம், அது வந்து அதனால் என்ன பிரயோஜனங்கிறது தான்.
ஸோ அதில் ஜஸ்ட் ஆன் த லீகல் சைடு, எத்திக்கல் சைடில் ஐ திங்க் ஹேமந்த்
I mean there will be regulation, but I mean a lot of these are small models. நீங்களே உங்கள் கம்ப்யூட்டரில் டவுன்லோட் பண்ணி நீங்கள் பாட்டுன்னு ப்ரொடியூஸ் பண்ணலாம். அதனால் ரெகுலேஷன் மட்டும் ஒன்றும் பண்ண முடியாது. ஐ திங்க் எனி டைம் ஒரு டெக்னாலஜிக்கல் ஃபார்ம் ஷிஃப்ட் ஆகும்போது அதில் தெர் வில் பி சம் நியூ ப்ராப்ளம்ஸ். ஆனால் நம்ம அது ஒரு போக வில் ஆல் அண்டர்ஸ்டாண்ட் இட். இப்போ ஆல்ரெடி இங்கே இருக்க மோஸ்ட் ஆஃப் த பீப்புள், நான் உங்களுக்கு ஒரு ஏஐ ஜென்ரேட்டட் இமேஜை காமிச்சு ஒரு ரியல் இமேஜ் காமிச்சா 90% உங்களால் கண்டுபிடிக்க முடியும் இதுதான் ஏஐ ஜென்ரேட்டட் இமேஜ்னு. ஸோ அந்த அவேர்னஸ் வந்து தானாகவே டெவலப் ஆகிடும். அது வந்து ஜஸ்ட் நம்ம எல்லாரும் பழக்கப்படுறது தான். ஸோ கொஞ்சம் பழக்கப்பட்டோன்னா ஏஐக்கு நம்மளுக்கே தெரியும் இது கொஞ்சம் ஏஐ ஜென்ரேட்டட் மாதிரி இருக்கேன்னு. இப்போ முன்னாடியே ரேடியோவில் மிமிக்ரி பண்ண முடியும்ல உங்களால், ஆனால் நீங்கள் டக்குன்னு கண்டுபிடிச்சிருவீங்க. அது அந்த மாதிரி தான் இப்போ இன்னொரு 5 நிமிஷத்தில் 5 வருஷத்தில் இதையும் டக்குன்னு கண்டுபிடிச்சிருவீங்க. அதனால் அது ஒன்றும் பெரிய ஐ திங்க் what is interesting is when politicians use it themselves. So for example, இப்போ பாகிஸ்தானோட பிரைம் மினிஸ்டர் வந்து அவர் ஜெயிலில் இருந்தே வந்து அவரோட சொந்த ஸ்பீச்சே டீப் ஃபேக் பண்ணி அவர் வந்து கேம்பெயின் நடத்திக்கிட்டு இருக்காரு. ஸோ it's a wild west out there. We are still in the uncanny valley. We'll figure it out. I think these kinds of questions are fine. The bigger question in AI safety is ensuring, as we were talking about, that we don't get stuck in that loop where economics, culture, everything rotates between what is dominant right now. Because obviously we know that art follows capital. When the Dutch were richer, the Dutch monuments were more in vogue. When the Soviets were doing well, we were reading Dostoevsky in Tamil here. Now we're reading Donald Barthelme. So
in business journalism in Bloomberg, they used to say always follow the money. Right. So AI is actually going through that. Any other questions?
I would like to ask a question. I am an intern in Dakshinachitra doing arts and museum management. So how would you think that AI would take up spaces in museum? But if you take Dakshinachitra, it is all about touch and feel. So without losing that touch and feel, what else would AI contribute for any museums?
Please.
Museums. Yeah, so I've actually worked with a few museums on this. One of the top museums in the country, actually. So what I think it can help you to do, I don't think the idea is to just slap the word AI onto everything. I would never say do that. But what it can do is, in today's world, how you tell your own story is more important than ever. There is no company or institution in today's world that can afford to not do great storytelling. So I would say use AI to do better storytelling about yourself, rather than in the earlier days you could just put something out there and you were reliant on a third party media to talk about you and people will come. Now you have to create your own stories in a more interesting way, and I think AI can be a big help in that.
It's also done really great stuff in reconstruction of works of art that are partially broken or lost. The Vesuvius Challenge uncovered the entire set of seals of the scrolls of Pompeii, which burned down during the volcanic eruption. So that was a great example. There's a lot of work happening in trying to model what broken sculptures would have looked like in full and so on. And then one thing I personally do when I go to any museum or when I travel to any new places, I use AI like a personalized sort of guide. And because it knows me very well, given I've been using it for so long, it can make really personalized recommendations for anything from a cafe to like a work of art that I might like in a space. So I think it becomes a very nice. You no longer have to think of the catalog or any kind of material as a static document. You can think of it as something that fits to the life of the user and becomes personalized to them and becomes a conversation in their head, right? And that's what Meru does. Is you talk to your copy editing draft. In my business, you talk to a contract. Presumably in your business, you talk to the artifacts, right? But you can do that.
One other areas, there's a company called Colossus. They are very much into bringing back extinct animals. So they are working with the help of AI. They are actually genetically coding these past animal information, whatever they have, to build either prototypes or whatever they're planning to do with it. So in these aspects, I don't know, maybe the Museum of the Future could be, extinct animals coming back and you have a small zoo sort of a setup there. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, just my question is more to do with the language of making, because I really like the way you introduced the session when you said that this is a derivative of a language and it has taken residence in the language. So it is a new language that we have. Now I want to know whether this new language you see any perception of threat to existing languages, like we are in the state of Tamil Nadu, where there's a huge language issues, that one is dominating the other, one is being sidelined and all that. So whether this new language that has entered is going to sideline everything else, is that kind of a threat exists? Or and also one more question to the panel is that, I think generally we are talking about the use of AI. I also want somebody to speak about who is creating this artificial intelligence industry, so-called, where it is coming from, and hence, what are the parameters that we are going to get associated with,
The second, I think, is probably a much bigger question that you have. Who's controlling it? It's a bigger one. But the first one, I'll give my perspective, and then maybe I could just move. So, I come from the ideology about lingua franca, which we currently have as English, which is largely being spoken everywhere. So, instead of actually looking at what are some of the minority languages that are not being represented in AI, the way I see it is, tokens would be the next lingua franca, because tokens are being coded and built for artificial intelligence. So every language is going to be tokenized, and they could be used in a way that these transformer architectures, which actually run these AI systems, when you give a prompt, it may give you an output that you want. So it could be, we could get into a space where learning any language or conversing with somebody in a different language could become far easier than we imagined. And it will create a scenario where we wouldn't have to fight a lot about what language we speak or don't speak, is what my sense. So,
I was just, for me, the story that comes to my mind when I hear this question is that of the Tower of Babel, which is this biblical story where before languages were created, all of humanity is able to coordinate very well because they all speak one dialect of one language, and they try to build this very large tower that goes all the way into heaven. And Yahweh decides that if the humans can coordinate this well, we should give them different languages, and then they stop being able to build the tower. But then when Ted Chiang rewrites the story of the Tower of Babel in his novel as the Tower of Babylon, I think he takes on a much more sort of materialistic approach of inequality to this story. And there what happens is when the protagonist climbs up the tower, because he's a miner who's going to go blow up the top because they've already reached the top, he then sees this vertical civilization where everybody speaks the same language, and they've built all this internal plumbing and rivers and entire farms and so on. But he sees the sort of caste system in there where, the people who do the most menial and physical work are in the bottom and so on and so forth. And he notices that even though everyone speaks the same tongue, the people in the bottom and the people in the top don't understand each other at all. So I think this is essentially the same problem we have again, right? Is we're going to be able to coordinate like never before. And globalization is already, this realization is, if we all speak English, we can do so much more. And now the question is, okay, there will be this kind of technological progress to unlock, but what will we lose in the way? And I think we have to be very cautious about sort of doing that coordination without creating either this class system where we have this pretense of a single culture, but really it's a totalitarian state, or this problem where, it's easier to go from having one culture to many cultures than from many cultures to one culture. So I think that becomes sort of the big question there. The pragmatic answer, of course, is AI can be nice in eliminating language barriers as a requirement for coordination. So you and I can work with each other and coordinate with it. I can fly into China and work with the factory by just having an app open where I speak in my language, they speak in their language, but nothing is lost in translation. So I think it's a very double-edged sword, and we have to be very cautious about it. That's why I think, there's been a lot of calls to put a lot more Indian language training data and models that are out there, and I think that's a very good call. And I think there should be a lot of non-profit work where we try to ensure that all our texts and all our languages have their bodies of work well documented, well digitized, and then put in the training data of AI systems. Because as Meru was saying, one thing we do notice, and we call these emergent abilities with scale, is when models become really smart and bigger, they get really good at understanding languages that even humans don't have memory over. So they can translate forgotten languages from various indigenous societies. So yeah, it's this constant balancing act, and I think what we have to do as a civil society is just ensure, as you're saying, very good incentives for the people making AI and very good representation in the training data that generates it.
Yeah, with that, we'll take one last question, or? Oh yeah, okay, cool.
But the panelists are still available if people have more questions. So a round of applause to our panelists, and thank you for giving us for telling us the contours of what is emerging, and sort of delineating where things might go, might not go. So thank you all for a very enlightening panel.